Hello, this is Jenny Clark with Solvability, and today's podcast, the Florida GOVCON podcast, is going to be talking about the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018. Now, you probably know I'm not an expert on these contract topics, but I wanted to share with you what I've absorbed from hearing other people and looking online at some different sources about really the highlights that I feel like are going to affect most of the people that I work with. So there's really 5 areas that I chose to include. There's plenty of other things in the NDAA 2018. First one's a little bit about other transaction authority, which is for prototyping and special ways that you can get enhanced materials through a little bit faster through the acquisition process. We're going to talk about incurred cost audits, which have been a big issue for a long time. We'll see if these solutions are going to make a big difference. LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, and some of the guidelines that have come out related to using that or not using that in different situations. And then I'm going to wrap it up by talking just a little bit about the rules for bid protests that have changed. So there's ceilings all the time for what's the limit on this kind of contract, what's the cast covered, what's the different ones. And so the ones that I wanted to point out is there's something called simplified acquisition threshold. It used to be $100,000 was the largest contract that could be put under the simplified acquisition. Now it's now raised to $250,000. So that's a little bit of room. The second one is micro purchase threshold, which currently has been at $3,000, is now going up to $10,000. So that'll make it a little bit easier for these very small purchases. You can have bigger small purchases than you had before. And then the last one is the Truth in Negotiation Act, or cast coverage. One flows from the other, has been raised from $750,000 to $2 million. When companies ask, although in practice, they really apply to larger contractors, and they're defined by cast coverage as those that have over $750,000 in annual contracts. I might not have that entirely right, but I always look at my small business and say, you're looking forward to the day where you could be cast covered. And usually cast coverage also is affected by having cost plus contracts. So the other part of that is that as a small contractor, those limits have been moved up. So if you thought you were getting close, check again, because maybe you're not. So those are the changes in ceilings. You may have heard of OTAs or other transaction authorities. What they're trying to do is say the acquisition process is so cumbersome. We've got to create some ways that we can be streamlining things when we're trying to get, especially prototypes and special tools or special gadgets to the forces that need them up in the front lines. So the other transaction authority that we say was a permanent part of the legal scene. They're really intended for prototype projects that enhance mission effectiveness or improvements to systems or platforms. It's going to be hard to define, but you can see that what they're trying to do is create a methodology that would allow things to be expedited in a way. Other transactions authority are intended for small businesses, but they've also included what they call non-traditional defense contractors. When I hear that, I think, oh, well, that's going to be somebody that maybe doesn't do a lot of government contracts and maybe doesn't need it, but maybe they're not small. And that's really what it's intended for. The rule that's called a non-traditional defense contractor means they haven't had cast-covered contracts within the last year. So you could see that that could allow some companies that maybe are big companies that have some special authority and they're not normally in the business of like federal contracting, that there could be some opportunities for them to participate where there weren't in the past, ways that they're able to be rapidly adapted. It does give some opportunities to use this other transaction authority, OTA, to make that work. Small business is a big participant in this, but there could also be nonprofit research corporations. There is a cost sharing provision inside that where there's an expectation that any of the participants would also come up with some of the money to produce this, to work through these OTAs. The idea being that maybe you'll get your direct costs covered, but not all of your overhead costs, for example, would be a way to think of it. Or you're going to work 100 hours, but 70% of that is what you actually recover costs for. These are all rules that are being developed, and you would definitely need to talk to somebody that understands OTA, and that's not really me. I'm just trying to give you an overview. I also did want to talk about what I've heard about consortiums or consortia, where they're creating a way that U.S. government and group nonprofit, and the funding for the overall series of programs would go to the consortia, and the consortia could dole out the awards or sub-OTAs to make all of this work. So we're seeing some changes in what's available and what's going to be accessible to small business. If you are in a technology R&D area, this might be something that you want to take a look at. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because we've got some representatives from SOCOM and SoftWorks that will be talking about what they're doing in innovation, and this is obviously going to be one of the things they could tell us a little bit more about. This one's near and dear to my heart, incurred cost audits. If you're a business that has cost plus contracts, you normally will file an incurred cost submission 6 months after the close of your fiscal year. The purpose of the incurred cost submission is for you to create a report that can be audited, and what you have to do in there is say, here's my fringe pool and my fringe base, my overhead pool, my overhead base, my G&A, my on there that will show, here are all my contracts, here's the direct costs, here's how I allocated the indirect costs to those, and they're checking to make sure that you came up with here's what my actual rates were at the end of the year. They're going to compare it to your bid rates, or your provisional rates is really what I should say, which are the rates that you use for billing during the year. And you can create an indirect rate visuals, assuming your actuals are a little bit higher than your provisionals, you could collect. If they were lower, of course, you're going to write the government back a check immediately, and they're going to want you close out and do your normal financial reporting for the end of the year, and you should go ahead and submit your variance voucher early in the fiscal year to go ahead and settle that up, because it may be years before DCAA comes to do audit documentation to prove it, and you choose to pursue that. So what's been happening for a long time is DCAA, Defense Contract Audit Agency, which is like the CPA firm for the Department of Defense, has been doing incurred cost submissions, but they're late. It takes them a long time. They've been chronically understaffed. These are massive audits. And for a long time, there wasn't any real prioritization of those. You didn't really know what was going to happen and when they would be doing their audits. What they've done over the last several years is for small businesses, small businesses would be almost under a lottery system, where if they get picked to be audited, they'll be audited. But if you weren't picked, they would actually, DCA would look at it, check for reasonableness, and send you a letter and say, authorized with these rates. We agree with these rates. But several years on this, all they had was an SBIR, a Small Business Innovative Research. And they've had to pay me to do their incurred costs. We've had almost incurred cost audits several different occasions, and they're always called back because the auditors get called off to do something bigger. And let me just say that these are not large dollars at all. So it's costing that small business a lot of money. But I'm on my soapbox. Let me get back to it. So if you do need more information about incurred costs audits, you can go to dcaa.mil for the incurred costs electronically. But if you're not doing cost plus contracts, or you don't have cost reimbursables on your time and materials, you're not prime, there may or may not be a need for you to do it. But the main thing is if you got prime contracts in their cost plus, that's your first call to action that says you got to go do an ICE. There's usually a clause in the contract, the allowable cost and payment clause, that will tell you that you're required to do an ICE. You could also ask your contracting officer. But if I hear the word cost plus, I immediately think, let's do an incurred cost. Okay, so what they found is DCAA seriously backlogged. It takes a long time to audit, not really the approach that we would expect to see in commercial auditing. For example, the concept of materiality never seemed to come into play. I had a company I was working with, and there was like a $6 million claim or something like that. And it seemed like we spent a lot of time for them to tell me that they just didn't feel like office supplies should be in the overhead pool because it shouldn't be allocated to production people because they didn't use as much office supplies as regular people that weren't in production. So you can see that if these are the kind of things that you're going to have discussions on, and you typically have to hire specialists to help you when you have issues for any small business. So this is great news for small business as far as I'm concerned, because what they're going to do is move toward commercially accepted standards for risk and materiality. Previously, they've always called it GAGAS, government accepted government auditing standards or something like that. I'm not really even sure what that means, but they are trying to move towards something that is easier to manage. The other thing they've been talking about for years is what they call third-party audits, and that would be where you had qualified private auditors, and those would be CPA firms that specialize in working with federal contractors. They would support DCAA, and the idea is that they'd have these qualified private auditors do some of the lower risk or more simple incurred cost audits so that DCAA could focus on the larger and more complex, which totally makes sense. Because right now it hasn't been that much of a priority who gets what when. So that's why the smaller contractors might have their audits held, not have an audit completed for 3 to 5 years, which is really hard to keep up with. The goal is that they'll eliminate the backlog by October 2020. Every year, DCAA does a report to Congress where they talk about their backlog and what they've done to solve it. And over the last several years, what they've done is they've changed it so small business is more of a lottery system, and they've decided to focus a bit more on high risk, but it is still a big issue no matter what happens. The goal is to make it so that the incurred cost audit is complete within a year. That's going to be tricky, but normally you submit your incurred cost submission within 6 months of the close of your fiscal year, and within 60 days, the DCAA office, your branch office, should let you know that they've received it and they've done an adequacy checklist. And what they basically do is pull up the spreadsheets, make sure the schedules tie together, so a cursory review, so they can decide whether it's accepted or adequate for their purposes to continue. They're also, as part of the NDAA, authorized DCAA to keep up with the audits, so that DCAA would be able to see that as kind of part of their extended resources that they could use for audits. And it doesn't mean that they would have the qualified private auditors go away at some point in time. As you may know, NASA several years ago said, well, we're just going to start doing our own audits because we're not really DOD anyway. So this has been a trend that's been coming. The other thing they're talking about doing is limiting the practice of multi-year audits. So there was a trend announced by DCA as an efficiency measure that if they were going to come out and audit a contractor, they'd go ahead and do 2 or 3 years at a time. Sounds like that might not have worked very well because they're talking about limiting that practice or only finishing up the ones they've got that are going that way or something along that lines. But I will tell you, to have an audit that's covering a 3-year period where everything is up in the air and negotiable, and the tricky part with these incurred cost submissions is that the values roll forward from 1 year to the next. So if you settle something for 2014, that updates the 2015 audit, which means you really should come back, pull back your 2015 incurred cost submission, update it, resubmit it, and so forth. So it's pretty nasty. The other thing it does say is there's always this issue, well, DCAA says, well, the contracting officer says. The wording inside the NDAA is the contracting officer has sole discretion over direct costs. So it's maybe cost advisory, and it's up to the contracting officers to make the final decisions. Lowest price, technically acceptable, LPTA has been with us for many years. And what we've seen is it's driven rates down for the contracts that are being let. It's reduced pay and salary in this area. It's also allowed companies that are really not as qualified to provide personnel, and those personnel not delivering those contracts and are not being executed properly. And it has had a backlash in cost. It may have worked a little bit, but it's not really going to work in the long run, and that's with the recognition. So LPTA is now prohibited for engineering and manufacturing development programs that are on major systems. So we'll see where that goes. You could see that making it so all of your technical personnel are just going to the lowest bidder might not be the right thing. That's always been a discussion. I'm not sure how they resolve it. The limits on LPTA specifically are you can use LPTA when you're not missing out on some innovation or technological advantage, and you could use LPTA for expendable or non-technical goods, and there's some more definitions besides that. It doesn't really stop LPTA. I think it's been out there for so long that it still ends up being part of in the back of the minds of the decision makers, because they've got budgets they've got to stay inside as well. But we're seeing more statements about LPTA wasn't really the best thing to have done, so maybe let's try to go the other direction. So it also lowers the reporting threshold from 10 million to 5 million, which means that if you're using LPTA previously and it was a $6 million, you're going to have that reviewed, whereas in the past it wouldn't have to have been reported. And I shouldn't have said reviewed, I should have said reported. Bid protest. This is a big one. So for several years, it's become fashionable for just automatic. During is going on, you could continue to be the incumbent and keep working, which means you'll have 3 to 5 to 12 months of revenue coming in while this works its way through the protest and counter-protest decisions and pullbacks and changes and everything else. So for 2026, there would be more extensive post-award debriefings to make sure that it's clearly covered why one was covered and not the other. Maybe they're going to provide more information. Some of it might be redacted, but allow a way that it can be seen how the decisions were made or the source selection, what the process was, to the extent they can share that information. There's also an interesting pilot program for larger contractors to reimburse DoD when there's denied GAO protest. And that will be interesting. When we said large, I think that it was using a threshold of over 250 million in sales. So, because you could end up paying all of those costs. Now, I don't know that that's going to make that much difference, because they're going to, but at least it'll make them stop and think about, well, we've only got so much we can go after. Are we going to have an outcome that's likely to be positive? So it should change the decision math in whether a company decides to go after bid protest or not. So some interesting things going on. There's so many other pieces to the NDAA this year. So I only went over 5 of them that I thought were most understandable to me, because as you know, I'm more on the accounting and cost side than I am on contracts, but I thought it was important to share with you what I know, because I'm bringing all the experts to the Florida GovCon Summit, which is coming up February 28th and March the 1st in Orlando. So we've got a great lineup of people that will be attending, and we look forward to having you there. If you'd like more information, hyphen Summit 2018 should work, and we'd like to get you there. It's intended for second stage small businesses in federal contracting, meaning those that have learned how to get contracts and now need to learn how to grow, because knowing that what got you there is not going to be what gets you to the next level. So we're going to be spending a lot of time on targeting, teaming, and tactics, in the sense of, you know, what are you going after? How does that fit? Looking, who are you teaming with? What methods are you using? What are you doing to make sure you're putting yourself in the most competitive light possible? So hope to see you there. Again, that's Florida GovCon Summit, February 28th and March the 1st, 2018 in Orlando. Thanks for listening.